I remember the exact moment I understood that silence was no longer neutral, it had become a choice, and like all choices, it carried a cost. That realization didn't arrive dramatically. There was no confrontation, no mirror-shattering epiphany. It came quietly, on an ordinary evening, when my mother asked me a harmless question about why I'd been distracted lately, and I felt my body respond before my mind did. A tightening in my chest. A familiar internal inventory of risks. How much truth could be tolerated without changing the temperature of the room? I said, "Work's just been busy," and watched her nod, satisfied enough to move on. But something inside me stayed standing, like I'd failed to sit back down into myself. That was becoming a pattern. Not lying, exactly, but curating. Editing. Living as a footnote to my own experience. For most of my life, I had understood identity as something static, almost administrative. You're assigned certain facts early on: a name, gender, expectations, and then your job is to live up to them with as little disruption as possible. I was good at that. Teachers liked me. Friends described me as steady. Family members trusted me because I was predictable. I mistook that predictability for integrity. What I didn't yet understand was how much energy it takes to maintain a self that is technically accurate but emotionally incomplete. The earliest stirrings of discomfort weren't about clothes or presentation. They were about attention. I noticed how narrowly I moved through the world, how my gestures stayed contained, how my voice seemed to hover in a carefully maintained range. I watched women, friends, coworkers, strangers on public transit, not with desire, but with something closer to curiosity mixed with grief. They occupied space differently. Not better. Differently. And I felt, without having language for it, that I was observing a dialect of humanity I'd never been taught to speak. Psychologically, this created a strange split. On the surface, I functioned well. Underneath, I was running a constant comparative analysis between who I was being and who I might be if fear weren't the primary organizing principle of my decisions. That gap produced guilt before it produced clarity. Guilt for wanting something I couldn't justify. Guilt for imagining change when stability had been handed to me with such trust. Family dynamics complicated everything. We were not unkind to one another. That was the problem. Love, when it's genuine, raises the stakes. I knew my parents' histories, their sacrifices, the cultural scripts they had inherited and quietly tried to improve upon. I knew how easily confusion could be mistaken for rejection, how quickly concern could harden into control if fear entered the conversation. I didn't want to be the source of that fear. So I practiced a kind of moral accounting. Was self-disclosure a right, or a burden? At what point does honesty stop being virtuous and start being disruptive? These questions weren't academic to me, they shaped how I breathed at dinner tables, how I edited pronouns out of hypothetical sentences, how I laughed along with jokes that felt slightly misaligned with my internal weather. Public misunderstanding loomed even larger. I had seen what happened to people whose gender expression disrupted expectations. Not always cruelty, sometimes worse, reduction. Curiosity stripped of context. Assumptions made efficient and permanent. I didn't want to become an educational object, a walking FAQ. I wanted to remain legible as a person first. And yet, integrity kept pressing in from the margins. Integrity, I was learning, isn't just about not deceiving others. It's about refusing to outsource your self-understanding to convenience. The more I avoided naming my internal experience, the more it began to name me instead, through anxiety, through irritability, through a quiet sadness that had no obvious cause. The first time I experimented with gender expression, it was alone and unceremonious. No mirrors positioned for revelation. No music. Just a private acknowledgement that curiosity, handled carefully, could be an act of responsibility rather than rebellion. I paid close attention to my emotional response, not excitement, not shame, but something steadier. A sense of alignment, like a thought finally completing itself. That moment didn't resolve anything. If anything, it expanded the ethical terrain. Now that I knew this part of me was real, what did I owe to myself, to my family, to the social worlds I moved through daily? Suppression was no longer ignorance, it was a strategy. And strategies have consequences. By the end of that year, I understood that transformation, if it was going to happen at all, would not be dramatic. It would be incremental, relational, and deeply moral. It would involve learning how to speak without demanding immediate understanding. How to take responsibility for the discomfort my honesty might cause without letting that discomfort dictate my silence. I wasn't becoming someone else. I was learning how to stop disappearing in plain sight. The months that followed were not marked by milestones so much as by recalibration. Each day felt like an experiment in proximity. How close could I move toward myself without collapsing the scaffolding of the life I'd built? Psychologically, this period taught me more than any book could have about cognitive dissonance and self-regulation. I was learning, in real time, how the mind protects coherence even when coherence is purchased at the price of authenticity. I began keeping mental notes the way some people keep journals. Not events, responses. How my shoulders eased when I allowed myself a softer cadence of movement at home. How my voice changed when I stopped correcting it mid-sentence. How quickly I reverted in public spaces, my body remembering the choreography of safety without being asked. None of this felt theatrical. It felt logistical. Like adjusting to a city whose traffic patterns you don't yet trust. Family remained the quiet axis around which everything turned. I noticed how often my parents spoke about worry when they meant love, how they equated predictability with well-being because unpredictability had once cost them dearly. Their concern wasn't abstract, it had texture and history. Understanding that didn't make my own experience smaller, it made the ethical question sharper. If identity is relational, then disclosure isn't a confession, it's a negotiation. I rehearsed conversations endlessly, though I didn't know it at the time. In the shower. On long walks. While washing dishes. Each version tried to balance clarity with care, truth with reassurance. I wanted to say, I'm not broken. I'm not impulsive. I'm not rejecting you. But I also wanted to say, this matters. It's not a phase of indecision. It's a recognition of something that has been patiently present. What stopped me wasn't fear of rejection as much as fear of misinterpretation. Public discourse had taught me that nuance is fragile. That once a label is applied, it can eclipse the person wearing it. I didn't want my life to be retroactively rewritten by a single disclosure, my past reduced to foreshadowing. I was still me. I needed them to know that. At work, the stakes felt different but no less real. Professional environments reward consistency and punish ambiguity, even when they claim otherwise. I watched how colleagues responded to difference, often politely, sometimes warmly, but always with a subtle recalculation of distance. I learned how easily inclusion can become conditional, offered generously until it requires adjustment. This taught me something important about public misunderstanding: it's rarely malicious. It's economical. People simplify because complexity asks something of them. I took responsibility for that complexity by educating myself. Not to justify my feelings, but to understand them. I read about gender as a social system rather than a personal quirk, about how expression interacts with expectation, about the psychological cost of concealment. What surprised me most was how ordinary my experience was. Not universal, but recognizable. That recognition didn't flatten my individuality, it contextualized it. It allowed me to see myself as part of a broader human pattern rather than an exception demanding explanation. The first person I spoke to openly wasn't family. It was a friend who had known me long enough to notice the changes without naming them. Our conversation was awkward in the way honest conversations often are, not because of conflict, but because we were both refusing our usual scripts. I spoke carefully, not to minimize, but to be precise. I framed my experience as an ongoing process, not a declaration of finality. I watched his face as he adjusted, asked questions, corrected himself, tried again. That mattered more than immediate understanding. What I learned from that exchange was crucial: integrity and self-disclosure isn't about perfect articulation. It's about staying present when clarification is needed. About allowing others the time you once needed yourself. About not mistaking initial discomfort for definitive judgment. That realization changed how I approached my family. When I finally spoke, I did so without urgency. I didn't demand agreement or relief. I explained what I knew and admitted what I didn't. I acknowledged their fears without adopting them as my own. The conversation didn't end with resolution. It ended with a kind of tentative openness, the emotional equivalent of leaving a door unlocked. In the weeks after, misunderstandings surfaced, not as confrontations, but as misaligned assumptions. A question asked too quickly. A concern framed as advice. Each moment required patience, not passivity. I learned to correct gently, to repeat without resentment, to recognize effort even when execution faltered. This, too, was part of accountability, expecting growth without expecting perfection. Publicly, I remained cautious. Not hidden, but deliberate. I chose contexts where experimentation felt responsible rather than reactive. I paid attention to how my presence affected others, not to shrink myself, but to stay grounded in reciprocity. Identity, I was learning, is not a private truth imposed on the world. It's a dialogue between inner reality and shared space. Through all of this, something unexpected happened. The internal noise quieted. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer arguing with myself about whether my experience was legitimate. That legitimacy didn't come from affirmation alone, it came from ethical engagement. From asking not just who I was becoming, but how. By the end of this period, I understood that transformation isn't a destination. It's a practice. One that requires honesty without exhibition, courage without recklessness, and empathy that flows in more than one direction. I hadn't arrived anywhere definitive. But I was moving, consciously, responsibly, toward a self that felt inhabitable. And that, I realized, was enough to keep going. There is a point, somewhere between intention and action, where self-knowledge stops being theoretical. I didn't recognize it when I crossed it. I only noticed afterward, when my internal questions began to sound less like interrogations and more like responsibilities. This part of the journey was the most psychologically demanding, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing external forced my hand. There was no crisis to justify change, no rupture to hide behind. What existed instead was a growing congruence between how I understood myself and how I behaved when I wasn't being watched. That congruence created an ethical pressure. Once you know something about yourself, you are accountable for how you live with that knowledge. I began to understand how much of my earlier restraint had been framed as consideration for others, when in fact it was also avoidance. Avoidance of difficult conversations. Avoidance of my own uncertainty. Avoidance of the possibility that growth might require me to tolerate misunderstanding without immediately correcting it. Recognizing that didn't make me reckless, it made me more deliberate. Psychologically, this period taught me about identity integration. It's one thing to acknowledge a truth privately, it's another to let it reorganize your sense of self in relation to others. I noticed how often I had compartmentalized, how me at home, me at work, and me alone had become separate characters sharing a calendar but not a narrative. Maintaining those divisions took effort. Letting them soften took courage. Family interactions became the testing ground. After the initial conversations, there was a lull, an uneasy calm where no one wanted to say the wrong thing. Silence returned, but it felt different now. Less like erasure, more like adjustment. I learned to sit with that. To resist the urge to fill every gap with reassurance. Growth, I was learning, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it happens quietly, through repeated exposure to the ordinary. My parents asked questions that revealed their frame of reference more than their judgment. Questions about safety. About permanence. About whether this meant my life would be harder. I answered honestly, even when the answers were unsatisfying. Yes, some things might be harder. No, I couldn't promise certainty. What I could promise was thoughtfulness. Responsibility. A commitment to remain in relationship rather than withdraw into defensiveness. That mattered. It shifted the dynamic from fear management to mutual navigation. They didn't need me to be fixed, they needed me to be trustworthy. That realization reframed integrity for me. Integrity wasn't about presenting a finished self. It was about demonstrating that I was capable of reflection, restraint, and care even while changing. Public misunderstanding continued to shape my choices, but it no longer dictated them. I became more skilled at reading context, at discerning when visibility was productive and when it would become a distraction from the substance of my interactions. This wasn't concealment, it was discernment. I refused the false binary between total disclosure and total secrecy. There is ethical space between those extremes, and I learned to occupy it with intention. I also became more aware of how easily people project narratives onto difference. Some assumed confusion. Others assumed rebellion. A few assumed fragility. Each assumption tempted me to over-explain, to defend my coherence preemptively. Resisting that impulse was difficult. But I learned that clarity doesn't always require elaboration. Sometimes it requires consistency, showing up as the same thoughtful, capable person across contexts, even as surface details shift. Emotionally, something softened. The vigilance that had once dominated my inner life eased. Not because the world had become safer, but because I trusted myself more within it. I trusted my judgment. My pacing. My capacity to repair misunderstandings when they arose. That trust was earned, not granted. It came from making decisions slowly, observing their impact, and adjusting without self-reproach. Educationally, I found myself becoming a translator, not an advocate in the loud sense, but a bridge. When questions came from genuine curiosity, I answered them with specificity rather than slogans. I spoke about gender not as an abstraction, but as an experience shaped by psychology, culture, and relationship. I emphasized that expression is not performance, that exploration is not instability, and that integrity is measured over time, not in declarations. What surprised me most was how this affected my empathy toward others. Once I stopped treating my own internal conflict as an anomaly, I became more attuned to the quiet negotiations everyone is making with their identities, gendered or otherwise. I noticed how many people live slightly misaligned lives, not because they are dishonest, but because they have never been given permission to ask themselves certain questions. That awareness made me gentler. Less reactive. More patient. By the end of this phase, I no longer thought of my experience as a transformation in the dramatic sense. It was an integration. A gradual alignment between values and behavior. Between self-understanding and self-respect. I wasn't moving toward a spectacle of becoming, I was moving toward sustainability. I understood then that the most meaningful changes are often the least visible. They happen in how you listen. How you correct yourself. How you remain open when it would be easier to retreat. They happen when you choose honesty that is careful rather than courageous for its own sake. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that there was still more ahead, not because I was unfinished, but because growth, once embraced, does not reverse itself. The next stage of my journey was dominated less by revelation and more by repetition, by the subtle, almost imperceptible accumulation of choices that gradually reshaped how I experienced myself and how the world responded to me. It was a slow unspooling of identity in public and private spaces, one that demanded patience I hadn't known I possessed. I began to notice patterns I'd overlooked before. Mornings became exercises in intentional presence. How I held my body while brushing my teeth, how I dressed even for solitude, how I arranged my hair in ways that felt authentic, not performative. These were minor gestures, invisible to most eyes, but they carried enormous psychological weight. Each small act was an affirmation of existence, proof that I could occupy my own life in a manner aligned with my internal experience. There was no rush. There was no need for anyone else to validate it, but I realized that the consistency mattered as much as the act itself. It was grounding. Family interactions became laboratories for ethical practice. I observed my parents with a kind of anthropological attention, noting how their fears were rarely about me as a person but about potential social consequences. Their questions, even when intrusive, were encoded with care. At first, I bristled. Every question felt like a test. But eventually, I learned to respond not defensively but descriptively. I explained what I understood about myself and admitted openly what I was still discovering. That admission of uncertainty, not of weakness, created a new dynamic. I no longer had to be predictable to be trustworthy. I could be evolving and still be reliable. That realization reshaped my sense of moral responsibility. Integrity is less about being flawless and more about being accountable in real time. At work, I began to experiment with boundaries. I tested subtle shifts in behavior, choices of pronouns, tone, attire, and observed how colleagues responded. Some adapted easily, asking clarifying questions, some stumbled awkwardly, revealing their own assumptions about gendered norms. These observations were instructive. They highlighted how public misunderstanding rarely arises from malice, it arises from habits of perception and the economy of attention. Recognizing that allowed me to approach others with gentleness instead of resentment. I could correct without condescension, teach without lecturing. I was learning that social awareness is both a skill and an ethical commitment. One of the most difficult lessons was patience. Internal transformation does not adhere to a timeline. Progress was uneven. Some days I felt entirely aligned with myself, on others, I recoiled at minor reflections in mirrors or social cues, as though I had stepped into a body that belonged to someone else entirely. These fluctuations were not failures. They were data. Emotional and psychological nuance, I realized, isn't about linear improvement, it's about observing variance, understanding triggers, and integrating insight into behavior without judgment. I also became acutely aware of the relational consequences of self-disclosure. Every small revelation had ripple effects. My friends, who once interacted with a version of me filtered through social habit, had to recalibrate. Some did so with grace, others struggled, revealing implicit biases I hadn't fully anticipated. Each interaction tested empathy on both sides, theirs in accepting nuance, mine in navigating imperfection. I learned to offer clarity without demanding compliance, to provide information without expecting immediate assimilation. Ethical self-expression is relational, I discovered, and it thrives in the tension between honesty and care. Psychologically, I found myself inhabiting a more integrated internal space. Where once I had multiple compartments for home, work, and public life, these compartments began to merge. My internal narrative became continuous, not segmented. That integration required reflection and self-inquiry, noticing how I felt after social interactions, journaling internally, even when no one else read or validated my observations, and paying attention to moments of discomfort as signposts rather than crises. Discomfort, I learned, is often a teacher in disguise, highlighting friction between identity and context. Family dynamics deepened in complexity as I tested boundaries of disclosure. My parents were willing listeners, but their understanding lagged behind my lived experience. Misinterpretations arose, not from hostility, but from the inertia of habit. A casual comment about normalcy could sting, a misaligned pronoun could make a private moment feel alien. I learned to respond not with defensiveness, but with clarification and sometimes gentle humor. I discovered that patience with others is a moral skill, not an emotional luxury, it allows relationships to evolve without fracturing. Publicly, I became attuned to the subtle mechanics of perception. Walking down a street, sitting in cafes, attending professional gatherings, every environment offered data on how expression intersects with expectation. I noticed how people unconsciously categorize, how their assumptions guide attention, and how small deviations trigger cognitive recalibration. I practiced holding space for my presence without over-explaining, offering minimal cues for comprehension without becoming a spectacle. Social awareness became a lived discipline, one that required emotional regulation, observational acuity, and ethical consistency. Educationally, I began to serve as a translator, not in the performative sense, but in an empathetic, explanatory one. When questions arose from genuine curiosity, I answered with specificity and context. I shared psychological insight without abstracting my experience into theory, social insight without moralizing, and relational insight without blame. I realized that education is not about persuasion, it is about presence, honesty, and the careful sharing of lived understanding. Through all of this, I noticed the profound moral dimension of agency. Every choice carried weight. Choosing to disclose meant accepting responsibility for the emotional labor it imposed on others. Choosing to withhold meant balancing personal safety and self-integration against the ethical imperative of honesty. Each decision was a practice in moral discernment, a negotiation between selfhood and relational accountability. And then, almost imperceptibly, I felt a shift. The internal tension that had once dominated my awareness eased. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. I was no longer negotiating with myself constantly about legitimacy, identity, or safety. I trusted my own judgment, my pacing, my capacity to navigate misunderstanding with integrity. I had learned, above all, that responsibility to oneself is inseparable from responsibility to others. That empathy, patience, and self-awareness are inseparable from authenticity. By the end of this phase, I understood that transformation is never about spectacle. It is incremental. It is relational. It is moral. And it is, above all, human. The most consequential changes are often invisible to others but deeply felt internally, measured not in recognition but in the quiet alignment of values, action, and self-perception. I was not yet fully realized, not in the sense of completion, not in the sense of arriving somewhere finite. But I was fully engaged in the work of becoming accountable to myself and others. And that engagement, I realized, is the ethical, emotional, and psychological heart of any transformation worth having. After a while, I realized that the hardest work wasn't in private reflection or isolated experimentation, it was in continuity. It was the slow, almost imperceptible labor of showing up as myself day after day, not in a moment of revelation, but in the mundane, routine spaces of life. The kitchen table, the office corridor, the bus seat beside a stranger, all of these became arenas for subtle practice, arenas where I tested not only self-expression, but patience, empathy, and moral attention. I began to notice how often the mind constructs a protective narrative around identity. I had long believed that being good meant being predictable and aligning with expectations. That belief had created a rigid version of me that functioned externally but faltered internally. Each morning, I now asked myself a simple but profound question: how can I inhabit my day in a way that honors both who I am and the people around me? The answers were never simple, but the act of asking changed everything. It slowed me down. It demanded mindfulness, ethical reckoning, and self-respect. Family remained the central axis. My parents' love was constant, but love is never a static force, it stretches and shifts under pressure. I noticed how they tried to translate their concern into actionable advice, often forgetting that their child was not a problem to be solved. Their questions, while sometimes awkward, were steeped in care. I learned to distinguish between interference rooted in fear and engagement rooted in love. The distinction required me to listen carefully, to respond deliberately, and to cultivate patience without sacrificing authenticity. I remember one afternoon distinctly. We were at the dining table, my father reading the newspaper, my mother fussing over the meal. A casual question about career plans became a subtle probe into the continuity of identity. He asked, without malice, "Do you think people will take you seriously if you keep experimenting?" The pause afterward was heavy with expectation. I swallowed, aware of the layers of meaning, the concern for safety, the fear of social judgment, the embedded assumptions about appearance and authority. I answered honestly, "I'm thinking about consistency, yes, but it's a consistency of values, not appearances. My work ethic, my commitment to my responsibilities, those won't change. What might change is how I show up physically or socially. That's part of learning how to inhabit my life authentically." They nodded slowly. I saw the wheels turning, the recalibration of their understanding. The room remained calm, but I could sense the ethical negotiation happening invisibly. Their concern hadn't disappeared, it had become a space we could occupy together. That moment, mundane as it seemed, was transformative. It taught me that disclosure isn't an event, it's a process. And the moral and relational stakes of that process are as demanding as any public act. Public life added another layer of complexity. Small gestures, how I carried myself, how I spoke, how I navigated professional environments, became subtle indicators of alignment. I noticed how colleagues, consciously or not, made assumptions about identity, gender, and competence. Some were warm and adaptive, others projected subtle biases that required careful observation. I learned to respond not with defensiveness, but with clarity, consistency, and measured explanation. This wasn't about advocacy for its own sake, it was about creating relational coherence without betraying myself. Psychologically, I learned to inhabit a broader temporal perspective. Identity is rarely linear, it ebbs and flows, sometimes in ways that feel counterintuitive. There were mornings when I would wake, glance in the mirror, and feel an almost disorienting disconnect between internal self-perception and external reflection. These moments were destabilizing, but they became opportunities for self-inquiry rather than sources of shame. I began keeping a mental ledger of effective responses, tracking where tension arose, what situations triggered internal friction, and how external environments reinforced or alleviated that tension. Over time, the ledger revealed patterns, triggers, safe spaces, supportive contexts, and moments of unnecessary stress. This self-awareness, methodical and patient, became a form of ethical and emotional stewardship. One of the most profound lessons emerged in friendship. I had long been surrounded by people who knew only the curated, predictable version of me. As I became more authentic, I noticed their responses were uneven. Some withdrew, not from malice, but from discomfort, unfamiliarity, or unpracticed empathy. Others leaned in, demonstrating curiosity, patience, and attentiveness. I learned that honesty demands not only courage, but also generosity in allowing others time to adjust, space to understand, and permission to make mistakes without condemning them. In this period, I also explored the educational dimension of identity. I realized that people often interpret difference through limited frames, psychological, cultural, or social assumptions. When I shared insights about gender, expression, and internal experience, I aimed not to lecture but to illuminate. I described not abstract theory but lived experience, the subtle ways in which identity shapes thought, the negotiation between safety and authenticity, the ethical dimensions of visibility. That approach fostered understanding without forcing compliance, empathy without guilt, and insight without sensationalism. Through repeated practice, I began to integrate internal and external selves. Previously, I had maintained separate compartments for home, work, and social life. Now, those compartments softened into a continuous field of presence. I could walk through public spaces aware of others' assumptions without collapsing into self-editing. I could navigate family dynamics without betraying my own understanding. I could respond to curiosity with precision, care, and patience. The integration was not dramatic, it was quietly persistent, accumulating in ways almost invisible to the casual observer but deeply felt internally. I also came to understand the profound ethical weight of agency. Every decision carried consequences: what to disclose, what to withhold, how to balance honesty with care. Responsibility for self-expression is inseparable from responsibility for relational impact. Every act of authenticity is a negotiation between personal integrity and social consequence. And yet, authenticity that refuses relational consideration risks isolation, relational care that denies authenticity risks erasure. The challenge, and the lesson, was to navigate the tension without abandoning either. By the end of this extended phase, I recognized a subtle but important transformation. My anxiety about perception had shifted from being reactive to reflective. I no longer feared judgment as an existential threat. I observed it as data, information to interpret, contextualize, and integrate. I learned to live with the inherent ambiguity of social and familial responses, understanding that stability and consistency are cultivated through practice rather than immediate affirmation. The cumulative effect of these months of observation, reflection, and deliberate engagement was profound. I felt alignment not because the world had adjusted to me, but because I had adjusted to myself in a relationally responsible, ethically grounded way. The journey was ongoing, open-ended, and iterative, but it had acquired coherence. Transformation, I realized, is not a dramatic point of arrival. It is the slow, patient practice of inhabiting your life fully, responsibly, and with care for both yourself and others. And in that quiet realization, so ordinary, so procedural, yet so morally and psychologically resonant, I felt a sense of integrity that had once seemed impossible, the integrity of living authentically, relationally, and ethically, moment by moment. The months that followed felt like living inside a slow, deliberate experiment, where every ordinary moment carried weight I hadn't anticipated. There were no dramatic events to mark progress, no climactic disclosures, no definitive turning points. Instead, transformation unfolded in repetition, in the accumulation of small choices and the quiet recalibration of attention, emotion, and social engagement. I realized, gradually, that identity is less a fixed destination and more a continuous negotiation with yourself and the world. Morning routines became exercises in alignment. I noticed how the small decisions, how I dressed even when alone, how I carried myself in the mirror, the cadence of my voice when I spoke to family or friends, had begun to carry an ethical significance I hadn't recognized before. Each choice was a negotiation between internal truth and external perception. Each gesture was an opportunity to inhabit my life authentically rather than habitually. The very act of showing up consistently, even in ways invisible to others, felt revolutionary. Family remained the axis around which everything turned. My parents' love had always been present, but I began to see that love is not static, it is tested, stretched, and often misaligned with personal truth. They wanted me to be safe, predictable, and socially legible. Their questions, though well-intentioned, were sometimes tinged with the anxiety of inherited cultural norms and fear of judgment. At first, their words felt restrictive, a subtle cage built from care. But slowly, I learned to distinguish between protective fear and rigid expectation. I listened more closely, responding with honesty and precision rather than defensiveness. I acknowledged my uncertainty openly, admitting what I didn't yet understand about myself and my process. That admission, far from weakening me, created relational space where trust could grow in new ways. I remember one evening clearly. We were sitting around the kitchen table. My father asked about my plans for the coming year, and in his usual practical tone, he added, almost as an aside, "Do you really think people will accept the way you express yourself?" The question hung between us, calm but loaded with all the assumptions of decades of social conditioning. I paused, aware that my answer would not only reflect my self-understanding but also shape their perception. I said carefully, "I can't control how people respond. But I can control how I inhabit myself, how consistent I am with my values, and how I respect others in the process." The conversation didn't resolve everything. It didn't need to. What mattered was the emergence of mutual understanding, not perfection, not immediate comprehension, but openness, patience, and ethical negotiation. I realized that disclosure is not a single act, it is an ongoing dialogue, an exercise in moral attention and relational accountability. Work presented a different set of challenges. I began to test subtle shifts in behavior, choices of pronouns, tone, body language, and observed responses. Some colleagues adapted easily, demonstrating curiosity and patience. Others revealed their assumptions in small, often unconscious ways. I learned to respond not with defensiveness but with measured clarity. I began to understand the difference between correction and education. The first addresses error, the second nurtures understanding. Social awareness became a daily practice, a discipline of observation and ethical response. Psychologically, this period was demanding. Identity does not unfold linearly. Some mornings, I would wake with a sense of alignment, other mornings, I felt disoriented, as if my reflection in the mirror belonged to someone else entirely. These moments were destabilizing, but I learned to approach them analytically and compassionately. I tracked my responses, noting triggers, safe spaces, supportive contexts, and situations of friction. The practice cultivated self-knowledge and emotional resilience. It became clear that patience with one's own process is as crucial as patience with others. Friendships became a revealing mirror of relational dynamics. People who had known me only in a curated, socially legible form now had to adjust. Some withdrew, not from judgment but from discomfort or inexperience with nuanced identity. Others leaned in, offering curiosity and care. These responses taught me a crucial lesson: honesty requires generosity, both for yourself and for those navigating your truth alongside you. It is not enough to assert identity, you must also create space for understanding to develop. I found myself increasingly functioning as an informal translator of experience. When friends or acquaintances asked questions, I answered with specificity and context rather than abstract theory. I described the lived, everyday implications of identity, the emotional labor, the cognitive patterns, the negotiation between self-perception and social perception. I emphasized that identity is not performative and that exploration does not signify instability. The act of sharing became an ethical practice, providing clarity without coercion, insight without spectacle, and understanding without condescension. Integration of internal and external selves became the central theme of my daily life. Where once I maintained separate compartments, home, work, public spaces, they began to soften into a continuum of presence. I could move through varied social contexts with a measure of consistency, respond to curiosity with patience and precision, and sustain ethical engagement without sacrificing authenticity. The act of inhabiting myself fully, moment to moment, became both an internal anchor and a moral discipline. Agency, I discovered, carries profound responsibility. Every choice, what to reveal, what to withhold, how to balance honesty and care, carries consequences. Responsibility for self-expression is inseparable from responsibility for relational impact. Honesty without relational consideration risks alienation, relational care without authenticity risks erasure. Navigating that tension requires ethical attentiveness, emotional regulation, and sustained reflection. It is a practice rather than a destination. By the end of this extended period, I noticed a subtle transformation. The anxiety that had once dominated my awareness of social perception had shifted. I no longer feared judgment as an existential threat but interpreted it as information, data to be assessed, understood, and integrated. Stability and consistency, I learned, are cultivated not by controlling others' perception but by cultivating deliberate, thoughtful presence. The cumulative effect was profound. I felt alignment, not because the world had conformed to me, but because I had cultivated the capacity to inhabit myself responsibly, ethically, and relationally. Transformation, I realized, is not about dramatic gestures, it is incremental, relational, and deeply moral. It is measured in the quiet persistence of showing up, observing, adjusting, and sustaining coherence over time. In this slow, careful practice, I discovered integrity, the integrity of living authentically while attending to the relational and ethical dimensions of every choice. It was an internal architecture, built brick by brick through observation, reflection, patience, and care. And in that ongoing construction, I realized that the work itself, the daily, intentional inhabitation of one's life, is the most consequential and human form of transformation. I had not arrived at a final, completed self. But I had achieved something more enduring, the capacity to remain engaged, present, and accountable, moving through life in a way that honors both internal truth and relational responsibility. And that, I understood, was the foundation on which all further growth would rest. By the time I reached this point in my journey, I understood that transformation is never sudden, and it is never purely internal or external. It exists in the continuous interaction between self-perception, social reality, and moral responsibility. I had spent years negotiating these terrains quietly, patiently, and deliberately, and now I could look back and see the arc that had been forming almost invisibly. I had learned, above all, that identity is not a point to reach but a dialogue to sustain. Every morning, every interaction, every choice of gesture or word was part of a continuous conversation between who I knew myself to be and the world around me. That conversation was not always smooth. Misunderstandings arose, small and large, from assumptions, habits, and the limitations of language. But I discovered that patience, both with myself and with others, allowed these moments to become opportunities rather than obstacles. Family remained central to my understanding of accountability. My parents' love had never been conditional, but their perceptions had required time and adjustment. I had learned to articulate not only my experience but also my ethical reasoning, why certain choices mattered, how I balanced honesty with care, and why patience and understanding was necessary on both sides. In doing so, I realized that self-disclosure is not a single act but a practice of relational integrity, an ongoing effort to remain transparent while respecting the capacities and boundaries of others. Friendships and professional interactions became mirrors for self-integration. I observed responses, refined my communication, and cultivated relational empathy. People who had once known only a curated version of me gradually encountered someone more authentic. Some embraced this with ease, others stumbled, revealing both the fragility and resilience of social assumptions. Through this, I learned that education is not about coercion or correction, it is about presence, careful explanation, and consistent ethical modeling. Insight emerges not from spectacle, but from reliability, clarity, and patience. Psychologically, I had moved from compartmentalization to integration. Where once I maintained rigid distinctions between public, private, and internal selves, I now inhabited a continuous internal narrative. The nervous tension that had once dominated my attention eased. I learned to perceive discomfort not as failure, but as information, a signal of misalignment or opportunity for growth. I no longer measured legitimacy against external affirmation, I measured it against consistency, reflection, and ethical coherence. Throughout this journey, I discovered the subtle moral architecture of identity. Authenticity without relational attention risks isolation. Care without authenticity risks erasure. Integrity lies in navigating this tension deliberately, ethically, and patiently, moment by moment. The practice itself, showing up, observing, correcting, listening, and adapting, became the most meaningful measure of transformation. And finally, I realized that the most profound changes are often invisible. They are not measured in dramatic gestures or sudden recognition, but in the quiet persistence of ethical presence, the deliberate inhabitation of life that honors internal truth, relational responsibility, and social awareness simultaneously. This is the work that matters, not because it produces applause, but because it fosters understanding, empathy, and moral maturity. I am not finished. I do not expect finality. Growth is ongoing. But I have achieved something enduring, the ability to move through the world with integrity, to embrace my identity responsibly, and to live in a way that respects both myself and others. That capacity, more than any external sign, marks the journey as meaningful. In the end, transformation is not a spectacle. It is not a narrative of conquest or drama. It is a lived ethic, a quiet, persistent, and deeply human practice of becoming who you are, responsibly and with care. And that, I have learned, is the most profound form of freedom.